Hello and welcome back to another episode on the Nicole Vignola Show. Today I'm going to be talking about OCD, what it is, and hopefully I will leave you with some neuroscience-based tips. Now, just one thing to acknowledge is that I'm not a therapist, so it is always encouraged to go and reach out to a professional for this sort of help. I will give you the science and I'll give you some understanding of what could happen and what could help change some of the pathways in the brain relating to OCD. But do bear in mind that I'm not a therapist. So what is OCD? So obsessive compulsive disorder. It is a condition that is categorized by intrusive and distressing thoughts and repetitive behaviors and compulsions, actions that are compulsive in an attempt to reduce the anxiety caused by these thoughts. So it's somewhat a negative feedback loop that reinforces the behavior. Now, is OCD genetic? Yes, there's a big genetic component to OCD. Can you develop OCD without having the genetic predispositions? Well, it's an amalgamation of different contributing factors that could all contribute to somebody developing some form of OCD. Now, there is a huge misconception that somebody who's very neat or likes their things straight is OCD. That is not true OCD. Someone with true OCD is going to struggle with the obsessive thoughts, and they may arise in the form of wanting to check that they made sure that the door was closed when they left the house, or whether they turned off the oven, or repetitive obsessive type thinking that keeps people stuck in it. So OCD is also influenced by environmental factors, so it can be exacerbated from the environment, predominantly stress. So someone who has a predisposition to OCD may fall back into patterns of obsessive thinking or obsessive compulsion actions during a time of stress. But here's the good news. Everyone and anyone with OCD has the ability to change some of the neuroplasticity of the brain circuitries that govern this type of thinking. And Norman Deutsch actually talks about this in his book. If anyone wants to read it, it's The Brain That Changes Itself. He talks about OCD and how the neuroplasticity of our brains allows us to quote unquote conquer some of our thoughts. How we can actually change OCD so that we can learn to live with it. Now, something I've never really discussed before is that I have had OCD in the past, categorized by obsessive actions that were definitely exacerbated by my circumstances, my childhood upbringing, my stress. And I can safely say that having done therapy, I've been able to get that under wraps. Does it come back? Yes, it absolutely does to some degree sometimes, especially when I'm really stressed. But I have the coping mechanisms to be able to hone in on it and take control of it, if you will, for lack of a better term. So what are some of the key brain areas that are responsible for OCD? One of them is the corticostriatal thalamus cortical loop. It's a mouthful, but basically what it means is that there's a loop there that then reinforces back in on itself, and that's important information. It's the cortex that is connected to the striatum, connected to the thalamus, and then back to the cortex. And this is where the quote-unquote issue lies, is that it becomes a reinforcing pattern that self-perpetuates because there's this connectivity back with the frontal cortex. Now, the frontal cortex makes decisions about how you're going to respond to a particular situation. And when there's an impairment in the system, it can lead somebody to think that the decision they need to make is to lull over these thoughts in a repetitive manner. Now, another key brain area is the orbitofrontal cortex, also responsible for decision making, but more importantly, it evaluates the value of our actions. When someone has OCD, there appears to be a heightened sensitivity in this brain area, which will communicate that there are threats in the environment when there are no threats currently present. And then to add on top of that, another layer is that it will make the decision to act upon these perceived threats with these compulsions that are aimed at reducing the threat. So we can see that there's this sort of abnormality in the loop of the brain as to how the brain communicates with itself. It goes from the cortex, which makes a wrong decision about whether something is threatening. It then goes through the striatum and the thalamus, responsible for motivation to act upon the thought. Now, there's one more key player in these brain circuitries in OCD, and that is the anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for error detection. When there's an overactivation of this brain area, it can cause a sense of something is wrong when there may not necessarily be something wrong. And that's that classic thinking: did I turn off the oven? Did I do X? Did I do that? And worrying that you didn't do it, or whatever the thought may be, which is governed by this error detection area that is hyperactive. Now, last but not least, glutamate. Glutamate dysfunction appears to be one more thing that happens during OCD, plus a couple of others, but I'll keep it succinct. Glutamate is responsible for the excitation of communication in neurotransmitters. So with every excitatory piece of information, so the release of neurotransmitters for communication, there needs to be an inhibition as well. And usually the inhibition comes from something called GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Now, it appears as though there's some disruptions in the glutamate signaling, which could contribute to those obsessive thoughts that are in a cyclical pattern. Now let's move on to what we do. Norman Deutsch talks about neuroplasticity, and he talks about how we can change our thought processes around OCD so that OCD can become more manageable. There are two types of therapy that generally work. One is cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps people reframe the thought processes, and this again will need to be done with the presence of a therapist. They will focus on modifying thoughts so that you can potentially divert the thought into something else. Now, generally speaking, when we're talking about thought interventions, we want to address where the thought or the source came from and why it triggered us. But with OCD, that is where the difference lies, is that usually you don't want to go back to the reason, you don't want to go back to the trigger, unless you are engaging in something like ERP, exposure and response prevention therapy, where a therapist will help you get closer and closer and closer to the root cause of what is triggering your OCD. So you'll slowly be exposed to the obsessions without feeding into the compulsions, so without taking action on them. And again, this needs to usually be done in the presence of a licensed therapist who will be able to give you a tailored approach to being able to shift these thoughts. Now, I usually pride myself in being able to give you guys top tips on what to do. Again, I've had huge requests for this video to be done. I can't give an overall tip or a hack. It would not be correct for me to do so. But what I will say is, if you can reach out to a therapist and go in, equipped with the knowledge, now you have the understanding. I also don't want you to self-diagnose, but maybe you've been hearing this and you've been thinking, hey, that actually really applies to me. You can go in fully equipped with an understanding of what may potentially be going on in your brain so that you can then better tackle it. So guys, please like, comment, and subscribe. Send this to a friend if you have any questions. I'll do my best to answer them in the comment section. And every 2 weeks, I'm doing a Q&A. So drop your questions and let me know.